She had exactly 72 hours to find a husband, or she would lose everything her father had built over 30 years. Not some of it, not most of it. Every single penny, every building, every account, every piece of land with her family name attached to it. And the worst part? She already knew this moment was coming. She had just convinced herself she could outrun it. My name is Mara Ellenfield, and 6 months ago I was the kind of woman who had a plan for everything. Color-coded calendars, backup plans for my backup plans, a 5-year roadmap that I updated every single January 1st. I was not the kind of person things happened to. I was the kind of person who made things happen, until the reading of my father's will turned my entire life into something I did not recognize. Stay with me, because this story gets complicated in ways I never expected, and the ending is going to leave you with more questions than answers. I promise that is not a bad thing. My father, Grantham Ellenfield, passed away in late autumn after a long illness that he hid from me for almost 2 years. That betrayal alone could fill its own episode. He was a real estate developer, old money, habits with new money ambitions, and he left behind a portfolio worth somewhere in the range of $40 million. He also left behind conditions so specific, so deliberately constructed, that his attorney actually apologized before reading them aloud. The condition was simple in its cruelty. I had to be married within 90 days of his death, legally married, verified, or the entire estate would transfer to a charitable foundation my father had established without ever mentioning it to me. Now, I want you to understand something before we go any further. I was not opposed to marriage in some dramatic, rebellious way. I was 29. I had been in serious relationships. I simply had not found someone I trusted completely enough to build a life with. My father knew that, which means he built this clause specifically for me. His attorney, a quiet woman named Patricia, who I had known since childhood, handed me a sealed envelope after the formal reading. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting, 3 paragraphs. He said he was not trying to control me. He said he was afraid that without pressure, I would spend my whole life being careful and never actually live it. He said there was one name he trusted, and that name was already on file with the estate. I want to give you a moment to absorb that, because I certainly needed one. There was already a name. My father had pre-selected a candidate, not in a legally binding way that forced me to choose him, but in a way that suggested the option existed if I wanted it. The estate would recognize the match. Everything would transfer smoothly. The name was Callum Dreyer. I had never heard that name in my life, or at least that is what I told myself for the first 48 hours, because somewhere in the back of my memory, something was shifting. Something uncomfortable. Something I had buried so deeply that pulling it back up felt dangerous. I agreed to meet him. Not because I was ready, not because I believed in any of this. I agreed because 90 days was not as long as it sounded, and because Patricia told me, in that careful way attorneys speak when they are sharing more than they are supposed to, that Callum had already agreed to meet me. He had already agreed, before I even knew he existed. We met at a restaurant that my father had apparently suggested in a separate letter delivered to Callum. A restaurant I had not been to since I was 17, on the night of my high school graduation, when my father told me I was capable of building something that would outlast both of us. Callum was already seated when I arrived. He stood when he saw me. And I want to be very precise about what happened in that moment, because it matters for everything that comes after. He was not surprised to see me, not in the way a stranger would be. There was something in his expression that I could only describe as recognition, careful, controlled, but unmistakably there. We talked for 3 hours. He was thoughtful, unhurried, and he asked me questions that had no business being that specific. He asked about a trip I had taken to Portugal at 23. He asked about a business decision I had made 2 years ago that almost bankrupted a small company I had invested in. He asked about my sister, Neve, who I almost never mentioned publicly, and about the falling out we had that I had never fully resolved. By the second hour, I was not charmed. I was unsettled, and I made the mistake of telling him so. He did not apologize. He said, and I am going to quote this exactly as I remember it, "I know more about you than feels fair. I think you deserve to decide what you want to do with that information." That sentence has lived in my head every day since. Here is what I eventually pieced together, and I am still not certain I have the full picture. Callum had known my father for almost a decade, not as a business partner, not as a friend in any conventional sense. He had worked for my father in a capacity that was never officially documented, as far as I can tell. Some kind of advisor, some kind of consultant, something that involved knowing details about my father's life that employees typically do not know. And part of what he had been trusted with was knowing details about me, not surveillance. At least, nothing that fits neatly into that word. More like my father had talked about me constantly and specifically for years, and Callum had been listening, taking notes. Maybe not literally, but in the way that careful people absorb information about someone who matters to someone they respect. He knew my secrets, not because he had investigated me. He knew them because my father had trusted him enough to share them. And my father had never told me Callum existed. That layer of it, that my father had someone in his life who knew the most complicated parts of me and had said nothing, was the piece I had to sit with the longest. It felt like a door I had not known was there, slightly open, with light coming through from a room I had never been allowed to enter. The 90 days became 60, then 30. I kept meeting him. Every conversation felt like two conversations, happening simultaneously. The one on the surface, where we were two adults being honest with each other, and the one underneath, where I was slowly realizing that honesty between us was more uneven than I had initially understood. He knew things. I was learning them in real time. 22 days before the deadline, I said yes, not because of the inheritance. I need you to believe that, even though I understand if you do not. I said yes, because by that point I had watched Callum Dreyer be exactly who he appeared to be, every single time, in every situation, without exception. And I had spent enough of my life surrounded by people who performed consistency while practicing something else entirely. The wedding was small. Patricia attended. 2 of Callum's colleagues, my friend Deja, who cried the entire time and asked me afterward if I had lost my mind. I told her maybe. But it was the most deliberate thing I had ever done. Here is where things get genuinely complicated, and where I have to be honest with you about what I still do not know. 2 weeks after the wedding, I found a letter, not from my father, from Callum, written before we met, addressed to someone whose name I did not recognize, describing a situation that sounded very much like our arrangement, but from an angle I could not fully interpret, like reading one half of a conversation that had already ended. I have not asked him about it yet. I know how that sounds, but I have learned something strange about myself through all of this. I am less afraid of the answer than I am of asking before I am ready to hold whatever that answer turns out to be. What I know is this: I am married to a man who understood me before I understood him. My father orchestrated something I did not consent to and somehow cannot resent him for. And there is a letter sitting in my desk drawer that might explain everything or might make everything significantly harder to explain. 72 hours to find a husband, 22 days to say yes, and somewhere underneath all of it, a secret. My father apparently trusted someone else to carry on his behalf. I will tell you what that letter says when I am ready.